was a gardener. Hattie Mae Smith Meadows, born in 1885, she died in 1966. Her house was just due south here on Linwood Avenue, 601 Linwood Avenue. The house is actually still there. The lot in the back where her garden was is currently empty. So, on behalf of Hattie Mae Meadows, can you repeat that after me? Hattie Mae Meadows was a gardener.
Hattie Meadows was a gardener.
Hattie Mae Meadows loved gardening.
Hattie Meadows loved gardening.
My name is Carter Q. I am an adult services librarian here at the historic Stanford L. Warren Branch Library. On behalf of our branch manager, Larry Daniels, and the staff, and those who came here, came to this building in 1945, but we came on the scene in 1913. So on behalf of that long tradition of books, literacy, and learning, we welcome you here to the historic Stanford L. Warren Branch Library. We have bathrooms that are here, that are just outside if you need to use them. But if there's anything that we can do during your stay, we want to help you in any kind of way. Just feel free to ask myself and the staff if there's anything that you need. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I am Ashley Trott. I'm the horticulture agent for Durham County Cooperative Extension. We're so excited to have you here. And I just wanted to present that this is a partnership. I've been so honored to be part of this partnership. I've been working with the Stanford L. Warren Library with Carter and Larry, and also with Kavana Anderson from Duke Gardens. And we're so excited to kind of bring these three groups together to be able to present this series to you. So if you ever have any questions about your soil or what's that bud, we would love to answer those questions for you. Just reach out if you ever anything that Extension can help you with. But I'm just going to hand it off to Kavana.
Yes. Hello, everyone. Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm up here to just welcome you a third time and say how pleased we are to have this partnership between these three organizations. I'm Kavana Anderson of Duke Gardens, which hopefully you have had a chance to visit. Botanic garden in the heart of Duke University that inspires transformative learning, supports well-being, and builds community, which I think this partnership program will accomplish all three of those tenets of our mission. And it's my pleasure to introduce the speaker today, our instructor, Stefan Bloodworth, who for many years was the curator of the Blomquist Garden of Native Plants at Duke Gardens, and then has embarked on many adventures since then, including starting his own landscape architecture firm, S3 Designs. And he's going to be guiding our learning today on design thinking, which is a really valuable skill when it comes to planning the relationship with plants that you're going to have. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Stefan. Thank you.
Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm going to kind of post up here in the middle so that the folks on either end don't feel neglected. Okay, so design thinking. So I am a design addict. And I am obsessed with the small details that exist in the natural world and have been since I was a small child. When I was born in 1970 at Watts Hospital, when it was Watts Hospital. That's me, my mom, and my grandfather. My grandfather was a professor at Duke for 40 years, English language and literature. On the right there, that's my wife and my two boys. You don't think any of my jokes are remotely funny, but that's normal. But I know you didn't come here today to listen to my life's history. What you really came here today to see was pictures of cats. So the internet is unanimous about this, that if you could in some way, shape, or form associate yourself with cats, people will remember you. So on the right, that's Fennec. And me, that's the staff of S3 Design. I have a small Airstream trailer that's my office, and Fennec's in there every day, not being particularly productive. The rest of the cats you see there, those are the support staff. They are usually doing exactly what you see them doing in the pictures. this is where I'm from. Okay, well, why do I have this picture full of lines? Some of you may understand that this is a topographic map. So the first thing I'm going to talk about in my talk today is patterns, the value of understanding patterns in the natural world, and how that understanding of patterns can help you see patterns elsewhere in the built environment, and how important that is. So on the left side of the screen, that red dot's where I grew up. On the right side of the screen, that's where I spent all my time. There's 200 feet in elevation difference between the two. The left dot is 200 feet elevation higher than the dot on the right, because that's what the dot on the right represents, the flat river. That's where I spent all my time as a child. I was obsessed about the things that you didn't see as you walk through the natural world. And so I spent a lot of time on my hands and knees. And then as I grew older, I became obsessed with documenting what I saw through photography. So my first foray into artistic endeavor was as a photographer when I was 16. And it's kind of carried through ever since, this obsessive, compulsive, if I'm honest, desire to see the little things in life and understand and appreciate them. And so those are just, that's what I do. That's my hobby. If I had a blog, if I was interested in social media, probably all you would see would be the pictures like this. Things that I experience that I think are interesting in the natural world, and the patterns that I observe while I'm out there. Okay, really quick, my timeline. In 1995, I started a small landscaping company because I needed money. I'd worked for a couple landscape designers in my past. At that point, I was 25 years old, and I did that for 8 years, and then the job at Duke came available. So I became the curator of the Blomquist Garden of Native Plants at Duke in 2002, and for 16 years I worked there and managed everything that went on in that garden, from conceptualizing design to picking up sticks. In 2018, I thought, well, you know, I think I can do my job better than my boss. Has anybody ever had that feeling before? Okay, well, I learned a lesson about being at the top of the pyramid. There's a whole lot of stuff raining down on you that you don't appreciate when you're underneath that big umbrella, which is your boss. And all I was doing during the 2 years that I was at Columbus Botanical Garden was I was a expletive umbrella for all the people underneath me. I was running around with a fire extinguisher, putting out fires between my board members. I had 35 of them. Some of them were billionaires, so they had opinions. I had employees who didn't get along. So I said, this isn't what I got into this field to do. And if I continue on this path, this is all I'm going to do. So in 2021, I moved back here, went to grad school, restarted my business because I had to make money. Finished architecture, landscape architecture grad school in 2023, and in 2024 I launched S3 Design, my landscape architecture firm. And this is my general philosophy about the design process. The design process is a journey towards understanding, and that understanding comes first through patient observation. Whether you are imagining a space that will be experienced by a few or a million, the journey should essentially be the same at its core. And that is something that I believe, after 30 plus years in this field, I believe it even more strongly today than I ever have. Okay, a little bit of vocabulary of what we're going to be talking about today. These are some terms you're going to hear me use over and over and over again. The idea of design intent. What are your big picture goals for your project? Whether you're designing a public plaza for 1 million people or you're designing a backyard for your grandkids. What are you trying to do? Materiality. What materials are you going to use in this space? And why? Opportunities and constraints. What are the things that are kind of on the opportunity side? What does your site offer you that is going to enhance your ability to do what you want to do to realize your design intent? What are your constraints? Topography, old concrete foundations in the ground, things like that that get in your way. And how can you bridge that gap between the opportunities and constraints? partie diagram. This is a little bit obscure. I hated this word when I was in graduate school. But you're going to see a couple partie diagrams in here that essentially is a very simple sketch that I can show you that captures some of the big physical moves that are trying to be executed in whatever design that I'm carrying out. Narrative. What is the story of the design? If you are successfully in executing your design intent when you start, your design intent and your story at the end when you talk to people about this landscape should dovetail very nicely. And then patterns. The first part of this talk is going to be all about patterns. It's going to be a little bit abstract. Your brain's going to go a little bit fuzzy. You're not going to understand why I'm talking about this. Maybe you will, maybe you won't. But I'm just telling you that the observation of patterns, whether they're big or small, is everything in design, period. Whether it's landscape architecture, interior design, photography, whatever, the ability to patiently observe your surroundings makes you a better designer. Okay, patterns. Okay, here's where it gets kind of obscure. Okay, so here's your first partie diagram. You're going to see this partie diagram later in the talk. This is from the Southern Terrace Gardens at the Columbus Botanical Gardens in Georgia, and this represents the big physical moves we were making in that garden. I'm not going to go into it anymore. I just wanted you to see a partie diagram because you're going to see it again. Okay. Now, you remember me talking about my obsession with the small things, observing patterns in nature. This was last winter on the Flat River. This is me taking pictures of bubbles and cracks and lines in the ice that formed on the edge of the river. And when I was in graduate school, I was responsible for teaching. I taught 5 different classes as a teaching assistant, and 2 of them were Design Thinking 100 and Design Thinking 101. And I got this idea, maybe I can use things like this for my students. What if we were to take very minute patterns in nature that have no meaning other than it is an absolutely random pattern that will never appear again in nature, entirely unique. What if we tried to discern meaning and use our brains to explore patterns and maybe bring meaning to them? So you see a little bit of an example here on that far top right. You know, do those little blobs represent, could that be like an urban scale? Could those be representing cities? In the top right, is that a lake? Are those islands? I use this as a term to help my undergrads stop thinking so hard and just see. Okay? And I became absolutely obsessed with this idea of starting small and helping people understand the patterns that they're discerning. Before you give them a job looking at a 10 square block area in downtown Chicago, and what patterns do you see here? Well, if you've never had any exercise in understanding patterns or looking at them, that is going to be absolutely overwhelming, and it was for the majority of people in my cohort. For me, my learning curve with all of the technology was way behind them because they were all 25 and I was 51 when I started graduate school. But my ability to discern patterns, I was an absolute pro because I've been doing it since I was 5 years old. So these are just pictures, snapshots of nature. These are the patterns that I discern when I look at them. Again, snapshots of little things in nature. These are the patterns that I discern when I look at them. And again, some of you are probably going, wow, this is way too abstract and woo-woo for me. Why are you talking about this? Well, you got me as your presenter today. So if I'm going to talk about design thinking, I'm going to talk to you about the way design thinking works for me. Okay? I don't know if any of you have ever played the game. There's a game called Dots. And it's essentially a series of transparent plastic sheets with little dots on it. And you're given the beginning of the game, you're given a pattern that you have to overlay all of these plastic sheets to create this pattern, this dot pattern that you see on the example. And I was an English major as an undergrad, and so you'd think that like it's something like Scrabble or whatever, I'd be really good. I'm horrible. I'm absolutely horrible. My wife, who is a dance major, can kick my butt in Scrabble all day long. But you give me a game like that, that's all pattern recognition, you cannot beat me. I don't care who you are, you cannot beat me. Because that is how my brain, when I was a child, that was something that I was naturally good at. And all of us, if there's something that we're naturally good at, oftentimes it's because we were encouraged or just our brain worked that way, and so maybe we cultivated that as a strength. So my design journey was basically based on this, my ability to recognize patterns as a young child and make sense of them, and to see them in the tiny things and the big things. And for me, I was a forestry grad student before I was a landscape architecture grad student. Tree identification. What's the most important thing, the most fundamental thing to identifying a tree? Well, okay, it's great if you can see the leaves, but what if it's 100 feet tall? Oh, it's great if you can find the fruit, but you're on the forest floor and there could be 50 trees around you. And when you're learning, how do you know if that acorn is from this tree or that tree? What's the most fundamental, simple way that you can identify a tree? You look at it. Okay? Just like, where are you, Kavana? Like, I know Kavana's face. If I saw Kavana's face in 100 people, I would know that was Kavana because I have seen Kavana's face for years. So, pattern recognition works exactly the same way. So I have slowly but surely developed this ability to walk through the woods, unfocus my eyes, look up, see a tree, know what it is. Because that is the only truly reliable way to identify tree species in the wild. And that kind of discipline of pattern recognition was something that I, again, became entirely obsessed about. And again, you can see you're starting to look at the patterns. What do they represent? And that's what I try to do, break them all down. Anybody birdwatch? Yeah. So I find birdwatching maddening because I can hear them, but sometimes it is very difficult to see them. But when you do, how many of you, warblers and vireos, during the summertime, there are so many warblers and vireos, I don't have a clue how you would know, how you would necessarily divide them one from the other. But one of the key things that I try to do when I'm talking about patterns is to break them down into very simple ones. I don't necessarily have to know that this is a red-eyed vireo or a prairie warbler, but I would really love to know, is this a warbler or is it a vireo? And one of the most fundamental little ways that I determined was, well, warblers tend to have these thinner needle-like bills, and vireos tend to have these tiny little hooks on the end of their bills. And it's those sorts of patterns, fundamental building block patterns, that I use when I try to identify things in the natural world. And then, anybody like toads? Some of you are probably like, oh my God, why do you have a picture of toads up there? I love toads. I think toads are awesome. And I think the call of the American toad and the Fowler's toads are some of the most beautiful calls that you can hear in the springtime and the summertime in the Piedmont of North Carolina. But how will you identify them? And so, like, literally, as a child, that's what I would do. I would pick up a toad, and it'd pee on me, and kind of wipe it off. And then I would look at the warts on the back of the toad and count the little warts in the dark splotches on the back of the toad to figure out if this was a Fowler's toad or an American toad. So, again, if I was to say one thing about design, I would say find your own way to identify the patterns that you see in the natural world and exercise that. And learn as much as you can about that thing that you feel strongly that you can identify those patterns. Okay, observing patterns in the landscape. So let's zoom out. Let's imagine that we're a skydiver and we just jumped out of a plane and we started at 10,000 feet with those ice bubbles. Actually, we're like down here, but really, we're very abstract. And so we're slowly descending towards the ground, and we're going to start looking at patterns as they exist in the landscape. So this is GW Hill Forest, about 3,000 acres of forest, 22 miles of trails. It's an awesome resource owned by NC State University, and it's a half a mile from my house. And this is where I spend all of my time. my family actually owns 300 acres, but I don't, and it's right across the road, but I don't go there. I go to GW Hill Forest because it's actually, the trails are great. I didn't have to build them. It's very varied, and I get lost in here. So again, here we are with these crazy lines all over the place. So for instance, one thing I want you to notice is this space up in here, where the lines are further apart. You know that's a flat space. These places where the lines are collected and darker, those are 2-foot contours, so you know when the lines are that close together, you're going straight down a hill. And then here, again, another flat space. Lines far apart, that's Dial Creek. There's 200 feet in elevation difference between here and here. So you know, wow, that's a great view, looking out across there. But this is where I spend a lot of my time in recognizing these sorts of patterns in the landscape, whether it's a huge 100-acre space or a 2-acre space or a 1/10 of an acre space. That pattern matters. So do soils. This is another pattern that I tend to focus on in the landscape. Again, here's that ridge line. Here's another high spot. And then here is where, I'm going to get over there, I'll show you, so I'm not going to neglect you. All these soils are weathered from the ridge tops, and the rain has carried them, which is why these soil patterns are different. Ridge top, ridge, 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 all this purple, water runs downhill, deposits topsoil, that's why it's so different. There you can see the drainage patterns. These are the sorts of things that are really important as designers for us to begin to understand. Again, it's a little bit of blurring your eyes. The idea that, you know, sometimes with clients, they'll call me up and they say, I want you to design X in my yard. And I say, great, but that's not where we're going to start. I'm going to spend time listening to you and understanding your site and observing the patterns in your landscape, and I'm going to tell you why X might be the worst idea that you could come up with in that landscape, and I understand why you want X, but I'm going to tell you that Y might be better. It's going to serve the same purpose, but it's going to function more effectively in your landscape. And then there are those trees again. That's where those trees exist on that landscape, and I know those trees, and I know where they are, and I know that the swamp chestnut oak or the swamp white oak exists in a certain area because of the soils and topography and moisture content in the soils. And I know the chestnut oak and the hop hornbeam exist in different places because, again, the soils and topography, the aspect, the sun, things like that. So, again, there are these trees again. Okay, and then sometimes serendipity. So I'm not really going to talk a whole lot about, in this talk about things that I've done as a landscape architect. There's one little project at the very end, and it is such a weird aberration compared to the projects I normally do. That's why I put it in there. But this is a project that I did for a really, really important client. Her name is Erica, and she's my wife. And she's a meditator, and she wanted a meditation garden. So that's our small house. We have a very small house. It's a little under 600 square feet, and we recently painted white. Pictures you're going to see are red because we hadn't painted it white yet. And we need more space. 600 square feet. If we ever have our kids over, and we got 6 cats in there, you know, it gets pretty small pretty quick. So we begin to look at this space, and we were given that it just made sense. There was an open space of lawn between our house and the woods. It was easy to get to from our back sliding door. You know, so those are some of our opportunities. And also, this is where my wife told me she wanted it. Yeah. So that was a constraint or opportunity. I could argue with that, or I could say, sure, honey, we'll build it here. So we start working on building the meditation garden. She wants moving water in there for sound, because that's just such a great thing to have the sound of water in a small space with walls around you and things like that. And so we built this meditation garden, and we use it every day. and it's like an extra room for our house. Maybe not when it's 10 below zero, but most of the year we're out there. But one of the most fascinating things that I had no way of planning for, but I do now, is you're going to see this north arrow in some of these pictures. And when I put a north arrow in a picture, it's there for a reason. Because it means it's important how the sun is traveling across the landscape. So for instance, if the north arrow here, that means the sun is coming up over here and setting over here. So in the morning when we're having our coffee on the deck, the sun's over here and it's shining and hitting the pond. And what does that do when sun hits the pond at a low angle? It throws water, it throws light onto the fence. And the fish in the pond are moving the water. The water's rippling, the sun's hitting the rippling water. What does that do? It turns that entire fence into an ever-changing work of art. Literally. It's like magic. And it only exists for about 15 minutes a day. But it is absolute magic, and it can never be duplicated. Because that angle of the sun, the clouds, the limbs moving is never going to be the same again. So that little show that exists for 15 minutes a day is not something I planned at all, but it is probably the best part of the whole landscape. And then when the sun's in the south, as it travels like this during the day, and the sun's in the south and it's shining across the pond again, what it does is it hits the water and it throws light onto the ceiling of our living room. And then, as the waterfall moves the water and the fish move the water, we have these beautiful rippling patterns of light, like an art installation on the ceiling of our living room for 20 minutes a day. Not anything that I planned. It was the greatest little act of serendipity. It was such a gift. And now I literally tell people, if we are designing any sort of a water feature in your space, that it is absolutely incumbent upon us to figure out, how does this water fixture relate to gathering spaces for you, living room, deck where you have your coffee, things like that, and how can we take advantage of the beautiful free sunlight we get every day to create a absolutely unique and different everyday work of art in your yard. So cool. Okay, so we are going to go through a series of case studies. These are projects that I've been involved with. These aren't projects that are me. These are projects that I was part of a team on. The top one is an industrial park. I mean, I never thought in a million years that I would ever be involved in designing an industrial park, but the city of New Bern came to NC State University when I was my final year of grad school. We were in an advanced studio, and the city of New Bern had said, look, we want some concepts on what a 21st century industrial park can look like. Does anybody work in industrial parks? So, typically speaking, when I go into an industrial park, it becomes very apparent very quickly that it was not designed for me to enjoy my relationship with the natural world in that setting, okay? The way the roads are laid out, the way the buildings are designed, the way the landscapes interact with the buildings, the way that it is apparent that people are or are not expected to enjoy themselves in the landscape around the buildings. But there's a movement happening in industrial park design where, how many of you are aware that RTP is in the midst of a massive master plan redesign? Okay, so this is part of this whole movement that people were starting to say, I refuse to work in a place like this. I can work, all over the world doing the job. Maybe half of these people that work in RTP are remote, or who knows. But people are starting to exercise their rights as employees to say, well, what do you mean there's no beer garden here next to my workplace? Why isn't there a beautiful pollinator garden or meadow near my workplace? Why isn't there some sort of a greenway where I can take a 5-mile run on my lunchtime at my workplace? I mean, these are things back in the 60s and 70s where people were like, tough noogies, dude. You come to work, you work for me, I write your paycheck, you go home. It's not like that anymore. The workplace and the attraction for people to come to work is more and more and more important every year. So that was part of New Bern's thinking, is we need to have an industrial park that is a draw for people to want to come and live in New Bern. And how do we do that? So I was a part of a 3-person team that was responsible for coming up with a concept for how do we create an industrial park at a conceptual level. So again, at a conceptual level, for those of you that may or may not be familiar with that term, it's very, I would call it a 10,000 foot plan, okay? Eventually that conceptual level will be taken to what's called design development, where you really start to get more into the nitty gritty. That's more at the 2,000 foot level, and then you get into things like construction drawings and planting plans and things like that, and that's really where the rubber hits the road. But the conceptual level is what's the big picture of what this place could look like, as if I was flying, as a bird flying, you know, way above the clouds, looking down on how this new space that you want to build is laid out. So I really struggled with this. So here's just a real quick interview. This is New Bern, all that built up stuff, and then the red is where the park is, where the industrial park site was. 1,500 acres. I couldn't wrap my brain around it. So what do you do when you can't wrap your brain around something is you just keep drilling down, and you just try to find little nuggets of information that will help you understand what it is you're trying to do. Because for me as a designer, if I can't wrap my brain, I use the term all the time, you're probably going to get really irritated with me, but if I can't wrap my brain around something, if the thought process of what I'm doing as a designer isn't almost intuitive and unconscious, I'm thinking way too hard and I'm coming up with junk. Okay, I have to know the soul of what I'm doing. What's my design intent? So for instance, with this project, our design intent was, design an industrial park for the 21st century, incorporating quality of life considerations, sustainable construction, and integrated ecosystem services. So ecosystem services, basically what I mean is, don't go in there. I mean, Mother Nature does a great job, trees, soil, plants, animals, at making our lives more sustainable, long-term, not just because they're pleasant to look at and be around, but also because of how they clean our air, how they clean our water, how they reduce sedimentation in our rivers, things like that. So with this, it wasn't going to be something where you're just going to go in and cut down 1,500 acres of trees and plunk some big, ginormous 400,000 square foot metal buildings down. It had to be very thoughtful, both from what's it going to be like to work here, but what's the environment going to be like. So, flat as a pancake. The white is the outline of the site. Flat as a pancake. Little bit of drainage down there in the south. So not a lot of topography to work with. So, well, okay, not a lot of interest as far as that goes. And if any of you have ever been to New Bern, you understand it's pretty flat as a pancake there. This is what the site looked like. When we were there, it was basically just loblolly pine plantation sites in different stages of having been cut or about to be cut. But this is what the site would have looked like 300 years ago. So this particular site is smack dab in the middle of the historic range of the longleaf pine. And longleaf pine savannas in this sort of environment would have been all over the place back then, before European settlement. So that was the first thing. That was the first nugget of understanding for this site. What needs to happen here? We need to honor the natural history of the site by designing a space where we can bring the longleaf back. And why did it look like that, but it doesn't look like that anymore? Well, it's the absence of fire in the landscape. So again, as the more that we understood the historic ecosystem that existed on the site where we were designing, the better we could understand kind of what needed to happen. And the more you understand fire in the landscape and European settlement trends. So for those of you who don't know, when white people showed up, they stopped fire everywhere they could. Fire was anathema to Europeans. So they built roads, they built fields, they cut down forests, and essentially by hook or crook, they stopped fire in its tracks from moving through the landscape. But it, as we've learned, you know, especially for ecosystems like the longleaf, fire is integral. They don't exist without fire. They need the fire to clear competing vegetation from underneath them. Their cones are actually dependent upon fire to open. And then the more you understand fire, you start to understand a little bit more about the cultural history of the region. So the Tuscaroras were an Iroquoian branch of a subset of the Iroquoian nations, and they occupied millions of acres in this part of the country at the time of European settlement, late 16, early 1700s in this part of the state. And the Tuscaroras would have been responsible. They would have observed what was happening with fire in the landscape. They would have noticed that the elk and deer and other large ungulates were attracted to the landscape after the fire, because the fire would burn through, the grassy vegetation would come back up, and that's where you would get great hunting grounds, turkey and deer especially. But as European settlement expanded in the New Bern area around the year 1700, they began killing, enslaving the Tuscarora. And then, as you can imagine, the Tuscarora weren't happy with that. So they launched, the southern band of the Tuscarora in North Carolina launched a war on the settlers in New Bern. And the settlers in New Bern enlisted the northern band of Tuscarora as allies and all but extirpated the southern band of Tuscarora during the Tuscarora War. And it essentially began the demise of the Tuscarora in that part of the state and in this entire part of the country. But this little picture on the right, so that's a picture of the capture of Joseph Lawson. So he's going to come up again, but he was a surveyor for the king in North Carolina, and he was responsible for going out and surveying lands that the king or the governor wanted. And so you can imagine, like imagine that you're hanging out in your backyard and a surveyor shows up and you say, "What are you doing here?" And like, "Oh, Governor so-and-so has decided that your backyard is now his, and I'm surveying so that he can take over your backyard." Well, you're pretty PO'd about that. Well, the Tuscarora were very PO'd about John Lawson. And he was captured during the Tuscarora War, and he was put to 1711. He met a very grisly end at the hands of the Tuscarora. I won't go into it, but if you're curious, they were quite creative. But they had an incredibly vehement hatred of what he and the settlers were doing to them. And so the northern band of the Tuscarora were probably like, "Okay, we're great. You know, we've gotten on the good side of the governor of North Carolina and the New Bern colonists." And so they gave, so this used to be all Tuscarora territory, millions of acres. And so out of the goodness of their heart, the settlers, the governor of the North Carolina territory, gave the northern band of Tuscarora, for their help, 40,000 acres on this reservation near Windsor, North Carolina. And then within 20 years, 30 years, they started whittling away. They started by hook or crook, expelling, cheating, stealing from the Tuscarora, until 60 years later, that had been whittled down from 40,000 to 2,000 acres. And then eventually, around the turn of the 17th and 18th centuries, 17th and 18th and 19th centuries, the Tuscarora were basically all but gone, essentially, from the state of North Carolina, and removed to reservations in Oklahoma, or they moved to be with their Iroquois relatives up north. So that's a very tricky thing as a designer to express. That's a very thorny, ugly period in North Carolina history. So how do you incorporate something like that into your narrative for a design? Well, the way we decided to do it was literally through promoting the relationship between the historic relationship between the Tuscarora and the longleaf, and emulating that through our design. Here you see that far right, that's how much longleaf we used to have, 93 million acres. And then on the far left, and then on the right, those tiny little dotted patches are what's left in the state of North Carolina. So we've gone from 93 million acres of longleaf to 3. All right. So there are species endemic to the longleaf ecosystem, don't exist anywhere else. So that becomes part of our design story. How can what we do, how can our reintroduction of the longleaf pine to this particular design honor the botanical and wildlife, zoological history of the longleaf? And then how can we be a part of a movement to kind of connect these isolated patches, which are the green, with these yellow patches, which are these, what we would call these corridor designs, where we try to reconnect these patches of longleaf, well, there's our little site right there in the red. And can we be a part of that as designers to connect those? There were natural spaces all around us. Hoffman Forest, owned by NC State, Croatan National Forest, military, the Marine Corps Air Station at Cherry Point. Hundreds of thousands of acres of natural space. Could we be part of that as a kind of a bridging point? Could our site do that job as well? So we really still struggled. We had these building blocks. We knew that the longleaf was important. We wanted to honor the history of the Tuscarora and their relationship with that ecosystem. We knew it was important for us to have this idea of a livable site, literally, where people could both live and work. So you could walk to your job. But how do we orient it? It's 1,500 acres. Where do we put all the buildings? It's like Legos. Like how do we orient the roads? What is the guiding design principle behind that? Because that's going to define everything. And then we stumbled across this great example from the landscape architecture firm Sasaki. They had actually designed an entire city in the Philippines called Ananas. 600 acres, so about a little under half of the size that we were working with. And they realized that climate change in poor tropical parts of the world, cooling, taking advantage of nature's ability to cool is incredibly important. You're thinking about places where electricity might be spotty, where it's not conventionally possible to air condition. How can you go back and understand how nature can serve as a cooling influence? And so then that was the last big light bulb for us that went on, because we realized that if we could have a sense of where the winds were coming from, we could orient all of our travel and pedestrian corridors to basically be wind tunnels to bring these cooling winds into our sites, and then to kind of overlay that with the idea of preserving the longleaf on the site and use the natural vegetation to cool the existing winds. That cool wind blows across your human site, and then it kind of makes for a much more pleasant space to be in. It makes for a much more sustainable place to be in. The electricity that's going to be required to heat and cool a site like that's going to be less. And then so what we did was we found the wind rose. This is kind of cool. This is a wind rose, R-O-S-E, like a compass rose, but this is a wind rose of New Bern. And so you see down here in the bottom left, the majority of our winds are coming from the south-southwest, like this. And so we decided to orient our site so that all of our roads lined up with where those winds were coming from, so we could carry those cooling winds across our site. And then that was when things really started happening. That's when my team members stopped being angry with me, because I kept saying, we don't know what we're doing. We can't, I'm just drawing lines and squares on this thing. I don't know what I'm doing. And then finally, I knew what I was doing, and they could stop being angry with me, because I was holding up the process, saying we didn't know what we were doing. Go ahead.
I just wanted to ask, did you also think about the flow of human beings through that space? Because you talked about the testimonials, so they could flow
You're
through
right.
certain places, so did that also come to?
Well, basically what we did was we tried to maintain with this design, the existing drainage patterns, the existing patterns of the perennial streams and permanent streams throughout the site. And for people who understand, archaeologists go back and look at, how Native Americans would have situated themselves. You typically would have been on the highest patch of ground in the closest proximity to water. So what we tried to do was retain, and in the next slide, so this is our design. This is what we came up with. And you can see what we tried to do. We have this huge band. This would be our longleaf restoration here, thinner band here, all of our winds coming from this direction here, winds coming from this direction here, flowing up through these streets, across these natural areas, and then all of these waterways that were existing would be preserved and enhanced, and then trails throughout, with the majority of the workspaces up there in that top little triangle set apart from the living spaces connected to green space. So, this was a fascinating exercise for me. I don't anticipate that I'll ever do this again. Fennick and I probably can't, as a firm, manage the design of a 1,500-acre industrial park. But I have a much greater understanding now of how challenging it is at that scale to really develop your story in a meaningful way, which is why we failed so often at scale like that, to develop a meaningful story that connects in so many different ways. So this design is now in the hands of the city of New Bern. It could be that pieces of it get reused for their final design. We don't know. That's out of my hands as designers, whether I was paid or unpaid. That's typically how it works. Go ahead.
So is the plan to maintain the longleaf pine controlled burns, or what are they, that's what they're going to do?
Yeah. So the idea would be, and that's a great point, because one of the things that when we were doing design reviews, that's when the professors come in and tell you you're full of crap. They're good at it too. One of the design reviews, that was one of the things that was brought up. Like, well, let's imagine that you wanted to burn this patch of an eventual longleaf forest. What's that going to do if all your winds are coming from, majority of your winds are coming from there, what is that going to do to everybody living and hanging out there? And the reality is that we have become so sophisticated now in how we understand the factors that influence how things burn, where smoke goes. Is the smoke going to rise, go high, and then leave? Is the smoke going to sit on the ground and make everybody cough? We are so sophisticated now that a fire master will literally say, okay, in this month period, this is the day that I believe is going to be the best day for you to burn this. And I mean, you remember, Kavana, when we burned the prairie at Duke. I mean, we burned. It was very small. It was a half an acre. We burned a half an acre in the middle of Duke's campus, and people were very afraid of this idea. But we had a forester told us, this is the day you want to do it, okay? And this is why, and it's going to be great. You're not going to have any problems, and they were 100% right. Which is why you don't just go out there with a matchbook and do it yourself. Okay, so that was kind of what I thought would be a normal breaking point. This is about halfway through. The rest of the case studies are smaller. That one was pretty long because it was 1,500 acres. So, Kavana, is it okay if we take like a 5-minute break? If you need to get up, go to the bathroom, you don't have to listen to me talk for 2 hours. You have to listen to me talk for 1 hour and 55 minutes, which is going to be much easier for you. And of course, if you have any questions or anything, just I'll be right here. But we'll reconvene. Let's say it's 10:52 at 11 o'clock. We'll start again.